Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. First, I want to thank our Director of IT, Mr. Brian LaRue, who has been extraordinary in setting up all of our Zoom calls and connecting with Mark Serra at the Shrewsbury Media Connection, whose support we appreciate to broadcast on local cable and through their streaming service. We're looking forward to this evening's presentation and answering as many questions as we can. First, let me start by letting people know that we do have some interpretation available. But before we do that, just so people can still see the panelists, I just want to introduce the people we have on the line as panelists. We have Sandy Fritz, who is the chair of the Shrewsbury School Committee. We have Dr. Ann Jones, who is the principal of Oak Middle School. Mr. John Kelly, who is the principal of Sherwood Middle School. We have Meg Belcito, who is our assistant superintendent for student services. Patrick Collins, who's our assistant superintendent for finance and operations. And Mr. LaRue, Brian LaRue, our IT director, is on the call to help us with any technical issues. But let me just turn it over for a moment to Sandy Fritz, the chair of the school committee, for some opening remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer, and welcome to everybody joining us this evening. I know it's been an unsettling time. You have a lot of questions. We hope to answer as much as we can today. We just ask for your patience. Things change as we move through this, but we do recognize that there's a lot of stress and anxiety around the reopening of schools, and we want to be there with you every step of the way. We also know as we move through this that there's going to be more questions and maybe more changes. So we need to do this together. But again, just ask for patience and help us as we move through this. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fritz. I appreciate it. And appreciate the support we've had from the school committee throughout this entire period of the pandemic. At this point, I'm going to share my screen and share some slides. So bear with me for just one moment. Okay, and if my panelists give me a thumbs up if you can see that slide deck. Okay, so again, tonight's webinar is for the middle school grades 5 through 8, our students who attend Sherwood and Oak Middle Schools. Last evening we did one for the elementary grades, and tomorrow evening we'll be doing one for Shrewsbury High School. We welcome all of our middle school families and staff who are watching this evening. I do want to make sure that people know that we actually have interpreters that are live on Zoom for 4 languages tonight: Mandarin Chinese, Brazilian Portuguese, Spanish, and Korean. And the instructions on this slide show you to click at the bottom of the Zoom window, you can click interpretation and then select the language. We do have live interpreters who are on separate channels to be able to do that interpretation as we go. So we're appreciative we're able to have that service this evening for you. I do want to begin with the key messages that we've been sharing all through our work around reopening school. The health and well-being of our students, family, and staff, of course, is always our first priority. Our focus for this coming year is we're really working hard to develop a safe environment that's for both our students and our staff that is focused on prioritizing well-being as well as enabling high levels of learning for all. And that we're doing this planning, of course, based on guidance and regulations we need to follow from the state level, from the elementary and secondary education department, while also closely monitoring the latest information from both medical experts and public health experts, and looking closely at the evolving data regarding the pandemic, both across Massachusetts and in our area of central Massachusetts, as well as specifically in Shrewsbury. This evening, the goals we have for this webinar is to help answer families' questions in order to help them understand our plan as it currently exists, as well as to provide enough information so that families can make the initial choice for what learning program to select for their children for the coming year. And there'll be more information coming up about that. But those are essentially our goals. I do want to let you know that this evening what we'll be doing is monitoring the Q&A function that's on your Zoom call for people on the Zoom call. You feel free to submit a written question. I do want to be clear, we also have some slides to answer frequently asked questions we've been receiving through the 2020 Reopen address that we've established. I do want to make sure that people understand there is no possible way that we'll be able to answer everyone's questions this evening. We'll do the best that we can, especially to answer the ones that we're getting multiple questions about, those kinds of topics. We're also putting together a written FAQ document that we hope to get out to you very soon in advance of the deadline of this Friday to make that initial choice. So we'll do the best we can over the course of this webinar, and then we'll follow up with additional information as we can. The initial choice process that we're asking families to go through is to log into your PowerSchool Parent Portal account. There's a blue link right near the top for your student that's called Fall 2020 Reopening Learning Program, Family Choice of Option. For each of your children enrolled in Shrewsbury Public Schools, would ask you to submit a choice by this Friday at 4 o'clock. And that will be enormously helpful for us to be able to continue the planning we need to do for the reopening of school for the fall. I want to be clear with families that this initial choice that you're making by this Friday may be changed prior to the start of the school year. A student may also change during the year from one mode to another, whether that's all remote to in-person or vice versa. And I'll provide some more specific information on that later in the slide deck. This initial choice information really will enable us to make more detailed plans. We really appreciate your assistance with this. So before I continue, I just want to share a little bit of information and data about our current situation relative to the pandemic. This slide is provided through a source through Johns Hopkins University. It references the 5% positivity rate for testing for the coronavirus. That is their guidance that under 5% that communities should be thinking about reopening businesses and schools and the like. You can see the green arrow there points to where Massachusetts was at the point this was published, which is well below most of the other states, of course, across the country. We know that there are difficulties that are being experienced in the South and the West and the Midwest in a variety of hotspots. We're fortunate in New England right now and in our own state of Massachusetts that the positivity levels remain well below that 5% threshold. And that's certainly one piece of data that's guiding us in terms of offering an in-person option for this coming school year. This is a map that the state released yesterday that they're using a statistic that they're focusing on, especially for school reopening, which is they're looking at the average daily case rate per 100,000 people based over a 2-week period. This map took the time frame of July 22nd through August 5th, and they rated all of the communities across Massachusetts and color-coded them. Any communities that are coded white have less than 5 reported cases in total. If it's green, it's less than 4 cases per 100,000. Yellow means 4 to 8 cases per 100,000, and red means greater than 8 cases per 100,000. You can see the arrow points to our community of Shrewsbury, which is rated green, so that we are below 4 cases per 100,000. And I do want to add in our first question slide here because I received a lot of questions today through the school reopening email based on the public articles in the newspaper and the Boston Globe in particular that talked about the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education related or sending some guidance related to this, where they indicated communities that were in white or green were thought to be safe in terms of the risk level for in-person learning, whether full in-person or in a hybrid alternating model like the one that we've selected here in Shrewsbury. That in yellow or red, you'd be thinking about doing more all remote, and that's something that got a lot of publicity today. What the article in the Globe didn't really reference very clearly is that the option that the state is requiring of all Massachusetts school districts is to provide a remote option for families who want to choose that. So the first FAQ today that I want to share with you is the question being, did the announcement of this public health metric being applied to school reopening made by the state eliminate the option of families choosing an all remote option? And the answer to that is no. And I communicated directly with the State Department of Education today, and they confirmed for me that families will still, regardless of this metric, still have the option of keeping their child in a full remote learning program. Essentially, this metric is intended to reference whether an in-person program is also advisable for a school district. And the hybrid program that we've chosen to offer for in-person certainly fits with the green rating that Shrewsbury has at this time. Other statistics, this was from the weekly statistic that's released by the state. This is from the Globe's Town by Town link. Shrewsbury most recently published a 14-day average of a 1.23% positive test rate, again, as compared to that rate of 5% that is referenced by the World Health Organization as under which you should consider a full return or return to some kind of in-person schooling. This data here was actually updated just today. We received this from the Worcester Department of Public Health, who provides statistics for Shrewsbury and as part of the Central Mass Health Alliance. And you can see this is the percentage of cases in Shrewsbury only. The last published number was 357 cases in Shrewsbury. That'll be updated tomorrow. But 5% of those cases were individuals age 19 or under. And I know that spread is across a variety of ages, from infants to young adults who are 19, and a number of ages all in between that. It's not really clustered at a particular level within that age group. And then you can see the different percentages, with the highest percentage, of course, being for those individuals 70 years of age or older. So that is the latest statistic we have in terms of the age breakdown for Shrewsbury itself. And I share these with you to again signal that we are looking very carefully at the health data, looking at the guidance from medical experts and public health officials. We'll continue to do that as we look at our reopening planning over the coming weeks and months. So at this point, let's get right into the summary of the program options that we have for our students. We essentially have the opportunity for 4 different cohorts of students to be provided with some type of learning in the coming school year. Cohort A is going to be a very small cohort of students who would have the option to attend school every day because of the high needs that they have as learners. And I'll talk more specifically about each of these cohorts in a moment. Cohorts B and C would be the students whose families opt to have them attend school on an alternating schedule with 2 days in person in school and then experiencing remote learning for the other 3 days of the week. And then for cohort D, that is the standalone remote option where students would not come in person to school at all. They'd be learning entirely from home or another setting remotely, again, not coming to school with other students. So let me talk a little bit more about cohort A. The school district will directly communicate with families whose children qualify to be in cohort A. And as a matter of fact, Meg Belcito sent emails earlier today to the students who would qualify for cohort A due to their individualized education program. So parents can look for those. If you received that email today, you know that your child qualifies for that. And if you did not receive that email today and your child has an IEP, that means that at this time they do not qualify given their level of complexity of their needs in their IEP. Only those who received an email right now have qualified. We are in the process of notifying families whose children are English language learners. We are going to have some English language learners who are at the beginning stages who may also qualify to be in school every day. And that's our English language learning department will be reaching out to families specifically in the coming days as soon as possible to let you know if your child will be able to access school every day of the week. At this point, cohort A is not open to families by request. And the reason for that is that we need to keep the number of students who attend every day at a small enough number so that we have enough spaces for cohorts B and C, and while still maintaining the 6-foot physical distancing between desks and so forth in the classroom. So we have to maintain this as a very small group. Depending on the number of families in cohort A who choose to be full remote, and how many, so that's going to depend. We're going to be able to determine whether or not we can open up any more slots in that cohort. For cohorts B and C, cohort B will attend in person on Mondays and Tuesdays, and cohort C will attend on Thursdays and Fridays in person. Both of the cohorts will be remote on Wednesdays. There'll be live learning sessions for those cohorts on Wednesday mornings. And in the afternoon, those students will learn through a combination of asynchronous lessons and other independent work because Wednesday afternoons will be the afternoons when our teachers and staff will be collaborating in order to make sure they're planning effectively, especially for the students who are going to be experiencing home learning on their remote days. So again, cohort B on Mondays and Tuesdays, cohort C on Thursdays and Fridays will be in person, and then cohorts B and C both will be remote on Wednesdays. And of course, they'll be at home doing remote on the alternate days when they're not in school. We're splitting cohorts B and C by last name. This was the most efficacious way for us to provide a balance in order to have roughly a 50-50 split among those students, and allow families, at the same time, allow families to have the same schedule regardless of what school their child attends. You got a child attending Sherwood and Oak, for example, or children attending both those schools, or you have a child in elementary school as well. Families made it very clear early on that it was very important for families to have the same schedule. So as a result, if you happen to be a family that has children who have different last names, we will arrange for them to be put in the same cohort, even though their last names differ outside of those two groupings. At this time, special requests for being in a different cohort other than the alphabet will be in order to keep neighbors together or carpools together. We're not accepting those at this time. I'm not sure we'll have the capacity to do that. I know we've had some of those requests. If we're able to do that at some point, we'll let you know. But we first have to see how many people choose the different cohorts, see what our numbers are like, whether we can, how we can break those down, and if it's splitting so that we're able to have the correct number of students in each cohort in order to enable that physical distancing. I should also mention along those lines that, there were some suggestions to do the cohorts by geography across town. The difficulty there is that, the number of students who would be able to are not equally distributed by age across different neighborhoods. That would create situations where the cohorts would have to be different by elementary, middle, or high school. And again, we wanted to keep it the same for the same families. For cohorts B and C, as far as a lot of interest in what's happening on the remote learning days, we want to be clear that cohorts B and C will have scheduled learning expectations on the 2 remote days when the other cohort is in person. This will essentially be the equivalent of time that the in-person days will be on essentially the same schedule. Maybe slight differences, by a matter of minutes, but there will be a schedule they'll be providing to students in terms of what's expected of them for their learning and their schoolwork over the course of the full day when they're at home. Again, a rough equivalent to what they'll be spending in school as well. This is obviously very different than the spring, where the time expectations were less. Obviously, that was a plan in response to an emergency situation, and this will be a much more robust situation in terms of the expectations for the learning students to do at home on the days that they're not in school. We still have a lot of details to work through in order to put some of the details together. Again, some of that will depend on the numbers we have based on people's selections this week. And some of that structure will vary by level between elementary and middle and high school based on the age of students and the independence level of students as well. At the middle level, there's a possibility that all students in a class or a team might be included in class meetings or check-ins, even on the days that they are home remotely. They might be able to join in together via Zoom. Again, we're working out some of the details of that to see what might be possible. But one thing I do want to be specific about, because we've had some questions about this, is whether or not students who are at home would simply essentially tune in via like a live video link to the class of students who are in person on that particular day and follow along. That is not something that is part of our plan. The reason for that is based on some of the research we've done into effective remote learning. Does not advise that as a good strategy. The instructional strategies our teachers use when kids are in person are quite dynamic. We have very dynamic middle school educators, of course, at all of our levels. It is not simply someone lecturing at the front of a room and writing on a whiteboard. There's a lot of interaction with students, things that just won't translate particularly well over a video feed and be particularly engaging to the students who are at home. We very much want to make sure that the experience for the students on those 2 days that they're in school are as effective as possible, and that the learning that's happening at home when the students are at home is also engaging in an appropriate way. And so that is just simply sort of tuning in to what's happening, what the kids in school is not advisable from our perspective at this point. On those remote days, the students who are at home will have a blend of accessing asynchronous, whether they're videos, screencasts, using different software applications, other academic tasks that can include reading, books, pencil and paper tasks, a variety of things. Of course, they'll be coming in and out of the school each week, so they'll be able to get assignments not only through Schoology, but also directly from their teachers and when they're in person. On those Wednesdays, we expect that when teachers are interacting with all of their kids, they're going to be setting learning expectations as well in terms of what's expected when kids are at home. And there also may be, depending on the day and depending on who the student is, some different live interactions with staff. That could include, as I mentioned before, class meetings or check-ins with a team teacher, for example. Could be a certain specialist who's engaging students with this particular subject, or it could be a paraprofessional who's connecting with students to assist them or answer their questions. So we're looking for there to be different kinds of levels of engagement to make sure the students who are at home, but it will not be full-time live teaching on those days. The live teaching will be happening on the days that they're in school, and there'll be a blend of asynchronous and independent work, along with some live connections that we're working through how we might be able to do that to connect them on the days they're at home as well. Teachers will be providing very explicit learning plans for those students to complete according to that established academic schedule on the days they're at home. And again, we expect this to be much more robust than it was during the springtime. Let me shift now to talking about Cohort D. Cohort D are the students whose families are opting for the full remote program. So those students would not attend school at all in person. The underlined phrase here is absolutely key, and this is why we're asking you to make an initial choice this week to help us with our planning. The number of families who have their students choose to be all remote, the number of students will make a big difference in terms of what we offer and how we offer it. It could be a combination of being taught by Shrewsbury Public Schools educators who are engaging with students remotely using the Shrewsbury curriculum. It could be taught and facilitated by Shrewsbury Public Schools educators, but they may be using some sort of online curriculum that's provided by a third party based on Massachusetts standards. Or it could be something entirely taught by educators from that third party education online company. There are 4 different companies that the state has engaged for public education in Massachusetts around remote learning. 2 are existing virtual schools. One is the Tekka Academy Virtual School. The other is the Greenfield Virtual School. There's also 2 online companies. One's called Edgenuity, and the other is called the Florida Global Virtual School, I believe. All of these have been vetted by the state. They all offer programming that is aligned with Massachusetts learning standards. We do not know at this time, and I know there's some questions in the Q&A about this, and we've received via email. We do not yet know whether we'll need to tap into utilizing these companies at all in order to deal with the volume, whether that's a very limited volume or a large volume of students who are choosing remote. That's planning we're going to have to do very intently next week once we have the data from you, the families, and then we'll be providing some more specific information. One particular piece that's important to note is that our plan is not for Cohort D students to be taught by the same teachers who are teaching a mix of cohorts B and C, as well as students, cohort students might be in school also for those teachers, because the planning is just not going to be the same. If we are forced to switch to all remote learning at some point during the year, depending on the evolution of the pandemic, it is most likely that students in Cohort D would remain taught by the teachers they've had to that point. But although we reserve the right to change that if we think it's going to be a better option and work better for students and staff if we have to go into that full remote piece. We will be providing more specifics again of what that program will look like later this month. We need that data about how many families are choosing this option to make those plans. Depending on the number of students again, it is possible that we could organize Cohort D students into a particular team, whether that's a 4-teacher team at Oak, or it could be 2-teacher team or a number of 2-teacher teams at Sherwood, who would be exclusively providing remote learning. Our preference, of course, would be to utilize Shrewsbury teachers using Shrewsbury curriculum. But that's going to depend on the numbers as they come in. I also want to make note that the length of time that students in Cohort D would be expected to be engaged in remote learning will also be similar to a full in-person day. It will also include a blend of live teaching and asynchronous independent work over the course of the week, and depending on how that's structured by the instructors that they have. It will not be live full time. It will not be only asynchronous learning and independent study, but it will be a blend of those things. And we'll work on the specifics of that, again, depending on the numbers we need to serve, and how we're doing that in terms of whether it's our own educators or a mix of our own educators and a third party. I wish I could be more specific about that, but we're really going to have to develop some of those details once we know how many of our families believe and know that they're going to choose that. So at this point, we'll get into some frequently asked questions that have come in, and then we'll start answering some of the questions that are in the Q&A. One question that's come up frequently is asking, can your child switch from one program to another during the year if you change your mind as a family, whether that's for in-person to full remote, or you start full remote and you want to switch to in-person? The answer to that is yes. I want to emphasize again, this initial choice you're making by this Friday, you'll have the chance to make that a change for that before the school year even starts. We'll give you another opportunity once we have more information about the program and cohort D. But then once the school year starts, you may make a change. There will be a waiting period, however, and that's just so we can have a successful transition from one program to another, making sure we are putting we have to make sure we have enough space, obviously with the social distancing, to be able to make that happen. And then we'll also need to be thinking about where is a student in the grading period? Have they just begun a new unit of instruction? Are they finishing a unit of instruction? It could be relatively quickly, or it could take up to as much as a 30-day cycle. That's going to depend on the situation and at which point in time the family makes the request. So it will not be an overnight change if you request that during the year, but it will be a change that will be afforded to families if they so desire. Another question, if your child switches during the school year from cohort A, B, or C to cohort D, or vice versa, from in-person to remote, or the opposite, would they still be taught by the same team teachers? So for example, a student begins in person, they start on their team, whether that, for example, could be the 7 Green team, and then at some point the family decides they really want to switch to full remote. They will not be receiving full remote instruction from the 7 Green team, because their responsibility is teaching kids in the A, B, and C cohorts. They would be moved to a cohort D group, whether that's an online team or some other version of whatever we're providing for that cohort D online experience. So I want to make sure that that's clear to families. And again, this is another reason why switching during the year will require a waiting period to make sure it's a successful and smooth transition. Another question people are asking is, will attendance be taken for remote classes? The answer to that is yes. Students will need to demonstrate attendance during the scheduled portion of their remote days, whether that's in cohorts B and C or D. We need to document for the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education that we are keeping track of our students if they're engaging with us on their remote days and spending the time that's expected of them. We have state requirements for how many hours of instruction combined, whether that's in person or remote, that we have to provide for students over the course of this coming school year, and we're going to need to track that. So we will be holding students accountable for attendance on those remote days. The other question we're getting is, will students receive grades? And the answer is yes. This is another thing that will be different from what we did last spring. Student work will be evaluated by their teachers. Again, whether they're remote or in person, students will receive report card grades. It'll be the same kind of report card system that we were using prior to the school closure. Obviously, the way we assess students may vary across ways that we'll be doing assessment in person, as well as some assessment that can be achieved through remote means using various software and other elements that our teachers can use with students. But they will receive assessment for their, both to help them develop, most importantly, and get feedback, and then also to signal the amount of progress they're making in their performance relative to our learning standards, as well as in middle school. Those of you who had middle school students last year remember that the schools switched to what's known as the HOWLs, or habits of work and learning, to measure some of the characteristics they're bringing in terms of their effort and their perseverance and the way that they conduct themselves at school. And those will all be applying as well, both in person as well as in their remote work. This next question is something that's been coming up a lot with both parents and staff. And the question is, are our schools' HVAC systems undergoing, sorry, that's poor language there, are they undergoing an assessment? And the answer is yes. You may know that, of course, Sherwood being a much newer building, actually not only has a state-of-the-art HVAC system that as of a few years ago, and it also does have climate control, which is a bonus, especially in some of the warmer weather early in the school year and late in the school year. Oak Middle School being built in the late 50s and renovated in the early 2000s. It does not have climate control, unfortunately, yet, although that's one of my goals before I retire is to have all of our schools climate controlled. But it does have an appropriate air exchange system to provide fresh air to all the spaces in the building. The Town of Shrewsbury's Public Buildings Division, under the leadership of Angela Snell and Keith Baldinger, is working very closely with us. And in addition to the work they're doing directly, they are having a third-party authority review all of our schools' air exchange systems across our 9 schools, also make any repairs that are necessary, whether that's a damper that might need to be fixed or adjusted in order to make sure we're getting the right amount of fresh air, and also provide a public report. Both of Sherwood and Oak systems meet the national ASHRAE standards for fresh air exchange. I'm going to ask Mr. Patrick Collins to speak to this in a moment. He's our Assistant Superintendent for Finance and Operations. But I would share with you that, and some of you know, but many of you don't, that at one point earlier in my career in Shrewsbury, I was the principal at Oak Middle School, which was one of the favorite jobs I've ever had in my career. So I know what it's like in that middle school. I know what it's like to be with students of that age. And I can tell you that one of the most memorable pieces of that is the smell of Oak Middle School, and including some of the molecules that move through the air there. There's a lot of Axe body spray that our male students tend to use during their upper middle school years in particular. So we know we have to have good ventilation for that very reason alone. But kidding aside, we do have meet those and we meet the standards. That's something that we're paying a lot of attention to. We know we have a lot of questions from our staff as well as our families. And at this point, I'm going to ask if Mr. Collins would be so kind as to just expand a little bit on what the expectations are around these air exchange systems, and particularly in spaces that don't have windows and the like. So Mr. Collins, if you don't mind chiming in.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. So basically, again, just for context, I would say that the good thing is in Shrewsbury, we've paid a lot of attention to capital improvements over the past couple of decades with lots of either new buildings to include Sherwood Middle School, the high school, the renovation of Oak Middle School, and then most recently the replacement, complete replacement and updating of HVAC systems at both Spring Street Elementary School and Patton Elementary School. So we're in pretty good shape overall, unlike some other school districts who unfortunately continue to defer maintenance in those areas. But basically, in terms of the Beal School, of course, we've got the new Beal School project being developed right now and set to open for next fall. And the existing Beal School, of course, was built in 1922. And at that time, of course, there were different building standards. And so your kind of typical, more modern air exchange systems were not a requirement. So the buildings department has contracted with a vendor, or will be contracting with a vendor, to bring in a fresh air system that will provide that air replacement and also exhaust system, and be changing that air just as if it had a built-in HVAC system. And then the other thing that I would mention, and I know it's on your slide here, is that, or the other slide, is that they have also contracted actually with 2 different vendors to get a third-party analysis and evaluation of all of our existing HVAC building systems, and that's heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems. And so we're looking forward to those reports and having an independent review and making sure if there are any gaps that we can close those gaps. These are large-scale mechanical systems and certainly require ongoing maintenance, but I think we're in pretty good shape, and looking forward to those reports, and also the temporary air system that's being brought on board for Beal specifically this school year. I'll turn it back to you, Dr. Sawyer.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. And I apologize, I was looking at some of the Q&A here. Were you able to mention about the, when we have rooms, so some rooms in our schools that don't have windows, but they do have the air exchange?
Oh, sure. Yep. So that is kind of, as you said, kind of a frequently asked question. It's certainly not a requirement in any kind of building to have windows, if you will, to provide air exchange. That is, in fact, the purpose of a operational HVAC system. So any school building, all classrooms, all office spaces, all gymnasiums, all gathering spaces were designed specifically to keep in mind the occupancy of that particular space and bring in fresh air based upon the planned occupancy. And so there's no requirement to have windows in all educational spaces. That's not a requirement. Simply having an operational HVAC system will provide the adequate and sustainable air exchange that's required to provide sufficient air quality. What we do know too is having a so-called hybrid or alternating schedule is we are in fact managing to take control and decrease our occupancy by 50%. So while a classroom might be built and designed for, in its HVAC system, designed for, say, a typical classroom of 25 students and a teacher or 26 occupants, and provide sufficient air exchange for those 26 occupants, we know that in an alternating schedule, that at any given time, we're going to have 50% of the amount of people. So 13 or 14 people in a room at any given time for your typical classroom. So very confident that the air quality will be adequate under our current situation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Collins. I appreciate that. Okay, so at this point, I am going to stop sharing my screen. And I've been running through some of the questions people have submitted. Some of them were submitted early and I think were answered by the information we provided. I may circle back to some of them for people who might have jumped on a little bit late before we finish. But also at this time, I'll ask for some assistance on some of these from our principals and other central office administrators as necessary. But let me begin with one question that was asked was, why is it that we're choosing to do the 2-day, 1-day, 2-day approach rather than a 1 week on or 1 week off approach that some districts have adopted? And essentially, the work we've been doing, I should mention, we've literally not only received hundreds of emails to the 2020 Reopen email address from parents and families. We've also had an opportunity for our staff, a couple different opportunities for them to have their voices heard. One through essentially a Google form that they could fill out with questions for the different subcommittees we established. And if you watched our presentation last Thursday evening, we had over 140 educators participating on 4 different subcommittees on different topics relative to the planning for reopening. And those staff voices are very important to us, and it emerged very quickly that overall across Shrewsbury, our educators preferred if we're in a hybrid model, that they're able to see and engage with their students in person at least once a week and not having a full week go by before they're engaged with them in person again. Different districts are making different decisions about that, but we certainly respect the voices of our educators and feeling that, and in some cases for our youngest students at the early grades in particular, being away from in-person learning for an entire week it can make a big difference. But even for our older students in middle school and high school, having that opportunity on a weekly schedule to be engaged with their teacher in person was felt to be preferable. So that's why we made that decision. There's another question about buses, about how accessible our buses we think are going to be. We've asked people to register for the bus if you believe you are going to be coming to school in person for the in-person option. And I'll ask Mr. Collins to answer this. First off, if families are choosing all remote, should they register for the bus to sort of save a seat for themselves in case they change their mind later? And secondly, how is it looking for those who are choosing B and C or who are in cohort A to be able to access transportation based on the more limited ridership because of the state restrictions on the number of students who can be on a bus?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. So I would say that, first of all, that the Department of Education guidelines that have been published really say that it would be best practice, if you will, to limit ridership to one student per bench seat on the school bus. And, in reviewing our typical bus capacities based upon prior years of full enrollment and transporting all students every day, that on some buses, we had upwards of 55 to 60 students scheduled per bus run, whether it was a high school run or middle school run or elementary run, 55 to 60. So when you go to an alternating schedule and you basically cut that in half, we have sufficient number of buses to transport all of our students, I believe, who wish to ride the bus, with the assumption that we know that some families are going to choose for their students to be remote anyway. So what we're asking is that if you choose cohort B or C, the alternating schedule, coming to school 2 days per week, and we certainly encourage you to ride the bus to reduce parent traffic. The school committee has waived the fee for the first half of the school year, so there's no bus fee for the first half of the school year. And we encourage you to register for the bus. And you can do that through the parent portal. And we have, in fact, as of this morning, around 7:30 this morning, we have over 2,500 students registered for the bus, which is great. If you are selecting option D, which is remote learning, not coming to school, please do not register for the bus. It's not going to help you to try to reserve a seat, because we're going to be matching your selection for which cohort you'd like to choose, and then also the bus registrations. Certainly, as we've talked about before, if there's somebody who changes their mind and wishes to go from cohort D to cohort B or C, an alternating schedule, at that time, you'd be provided an opportunity to sign up for bus service. But what we want to do is to get a true accounting of exactly which students we should be expecting to pick up for ridership for the start of the school year. So it doesn't help you, and it certainly doesn't help us if you're going to be cohort D to sign up for the busing. So please don't do that. And we certainly do encourage students to ride the bus to cut down on parent traffic again, and also just reiterating that the bus fee is waived for the first half of the school year through December. The school committee will revisit this topic for the second half of the school year, and we'll just see how we're doing then.
Thank you very much, Mr. Collins. I appreciate that. There's some great questions in the Q&A. We'll get to as many as we can in the time that we have. Maybe ask our principals to give some information. There's some questions about just sort of what the things might look like inside the school on an in-person day in terms of students going to lunch, where would lunch be held, whether they would have a chance for mask breaks or go outside for some recess. Our students at both Sherwood and Oak typically go outside. Sherwood's a little more traditional recess. Oak's a little bit more of a social break outside after lunch, typically. But how we see that looking different under these circumstances that we have to follow the various restrictions. So maybe Dr. Jones and Mr. Kelly, if you could give a little bit of a picture for people what that might look like.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. I want to welcome the families, especially the new families that are new to Oak. I know we haven't had a chance to meet yet or do any overviews or open houses, but I'm really looking forward to meeting you all. Um, Lunch will look different. We are utilizing our gymnasium and our cafeteria for lunches. Students will be staggered in terms of their dismissal from classrooms in order to make their way to lunch. We will be working to make sure that we're spacing students out while they go and pick up their lunches. The cafeteria, and we anticipate the cafeteria in the gymnasium will have desks that will be 6 feet apart. So students should have plenty of space in those areas to take off their mask and get a break from their mask.
Thank you. Any thoughts, Dr. Jones and Mr. Kelly, around how students moving around the school might look in terms of going, when they're going to lunch, when they're leaving, and maybe a little bit too about outdoor opportunities, whether that's recess, mask breaks, physical education. Mr. Kelly, what are some thoughts in terms of how Sherwood's shaping up around those issues?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. First, again, I want to welcome all of our parents joining us. As Dr. Jones said, we are excited to meet all of you at some point, whether that's partially in person or partially remotely. It certainly gets quiet here around the summer months. I think, for us, the most important thing is that we can welcome students back into the building, particularly at the beginning of the year, and help them understand what those new routines look like. So I know there was a question there in the chat as far as, parent drop off and pick up, and, how do we ensure safety with those things? As Dr. Jones said, a lot of our procedures and protocols that we already have in place will be in place. I think what will look a little bit different, obviously, is students and staff being in the building, wearing masks, and making sure that students are going directly to their classrooms. So one of the things when students arrive to school that will look a little different is they won't be going to their locker and sort of gathering around their locker to maybe remove their belongings. They'll be going right into the classroom to ensure that they're in a safe space, and teachers will be there greeting them, obviously, in the morning. I think the same goes for those transition periods, whether it's transitioning from class to class, or as Dr. Jones said, transitioning from a class to the cafeteria, that would be monitored by staff. Same goes for bathroom, that those would be monitored by staff to ensure that we have control over how many students are moving throughout the building, and making sure that they're following those protocols. I think as far as breaks, we're planning to have a mask break for students in the morning, and then a mask break for students after lunch. And then, as Dr. Jones said, lunch would be, and recess would be considered a mask break for students. And those mask breaks generally ranging in the area of 15 to 20 minutes per student. I personally don't have a lot of anxiety about it. I'm very confident. I think our students will catch on very quickly to those protocols. I know some parents might be anxious about recess, but quite honestly, I think students will just be excited to be outside. And I think with, again, some proper coaching and understanding those protocols with students, that they can be outside 6 feet apart and just enjoying the fresh air. Will that feel different, look different? Yes. But I'm confident that our students will get accustomed to those new routines.
Thank you very much, John. Another thing to ask our principals to talk about a little bit is what people can expect relative to special subjects. Foreign language, unfortunately, due to budget reasons, was cut from Sherwood for the upcoming year. So it's no longer starting in 6th grade, but it certainly continues in 7th and 8th grade. We have the various allied arts that students are engaged with, special subjects. And then there's also traditionally band, chorus, and orchestra. So maybe if the principals could take us through sort of how that would look. We know there are some details in terms of how they may be delivered depending on how many students are actually in person versus full remote. But in sort of a general sense, what are some of the things that families could expect when it comes to the special subjects and allied arts?
Our allied arts students will rotate through allied arts, and they'll have a selection of exploratory classes to take. Those will range from music to possibly some performing arts. options, art, health, PE. Our PE classes will be held for the most part outside. If the weather isn't working in our favor, then we have contingencies to have classes indoors where they can do things like yoga and mindfulness and things like that. As far as band, chorus, and orchestra, we have decided to put band, chorus, and orchestra on hiatus for the first part of the year at least. It appeared to us that the safety, our spaces weren't large enough to ensure that we could safely hold band, chorus, and orchestra in those ensembles, given how many students participate in them this year. The teachers that teach band, chorus, and orchestra will be offering music-related and performing arts-related allied arts over the course of the first and second 30-day cycles, which is the first trimester. We will be revisiting this to see when is the best time to start up band, chorus, and orchestra. I believe that instrument lessons will continue, and hopefully we'll be able to bring those back as quickly as possible.
Yeah, that's a really important piece of information, so we appreciate you sharing that. We have extraordinary band, chorus, and orchestra programs, and from the middle school right up to the high school. And we do have some restrictions based on the state requirements for those, and obviously the safety element comes first. But we're very pleased, and we have some really creative teachers in that department. We're sure they'll be able to provide students with some interesting educational experiences during the time that those performance ensembles are on hiatus. And we do believe the musical lessons program, as we continued them last spring through Zoom, will be able to continue that as well. And obviously physical education being outdoors as much as possible. At this point, let's shift gears a little bit. I'm going to ask Ms. Belcito to comment. There's some questions about students who have special needs who may not qualify for cohort A in terms of delivery of service. And also, for students with IEPs whose families choose to be in cohort D in a full remote model, how we would be thinking about delivering the supports and services that those students require, and which is incredibly complex work. It's complex work under the normal situation, but certainly in a remote or hybrid model or remote model, it makes it that much more challenging. And I know our special educators have been doing an incredible job over the course of last spring and this summer as well, as we're just finishing up 4 weeks of in-person special education programming for students with complex special needs that's been happening at Sherwood Middle School over the past 4 weeks. It's been very successful. But let me ask Ms. Belcito to comment a bit about our opportunities for students with special needs.
Thanks, Dr. Sawyer. I have noticed some questions about cohort A. So earlier today, we were able to communicate with families whose students met the criteria for cohort A. We do know that based on the numbers that come in after Friday, we will be able to look further and see if we have additional spots for cohort A. In looking at the criteria right now, it will be for our most complex learners. So families, I know that it's a very difficult time, and there have been a lot of requests for their students to be in cohort A for various reasons. But please know that the district will be reaching out, responding to those concerns, and we will work with you during this time. But what we should emphasize is that all IEP services that have been accepted will be delivered, and how that gets delivered will be worked out with your liaisons and your teams. If your child is in cohort A, you certainly will have the in-person services. In B, C, where your child's in a hybrid model, you will receive services when your student is remote, and then also obviously on the days that they're in person. So that's just quickly around that. And then with cohort D, the students in cohort D that have IEP services, we will be delivering those services. We have details to work out, as Dr. Sawyer mentioned a little bit earlier, when it comes to whether it's a third-party agency, whether it's our staff delivering the services. So those pieces is still forthcoming. And was there anything else, Dr. Sawyer, that you wanted me? I feel like you mentioned something else.
No, let's see if some other questions come up in the chat, but I think that gives some good perspective on our special education students. We certainly are looking to figure out how we can, if a student who has an IEP is in the hybrid where they're switching off in person and remote days, how we can make sure we're providing some different supports on the remote days as well, and the way we can deliver those through the use of paraprofessionals who'd be assisting normally inside the classroom is one example of a way we might do some of that to help keep kids on track and support their needs.
Absolutely. One other thing I noticed in a couple of the questions regarding our co-teaching. So we do plan to have co-teaching in the hybrid when the students are in person. Again, it's going to depend on the numbers and the spacing within the classrooms, but that's something that we continue to work through in the next few days, weeks.
Thank you. We're also seeing some questions in the chat about orientation for students who are coming new into a school. Mr. Kelly, can you speak a little bit about orientation at Sherwood?
Absolutely, yes. So, and I know that, for parents and students, that brings about a lot of anxiety, even under normal circumstances. But certainly this summer, I think there's extra anxiety about that. And just so you're all aware, I just had a child recently graduate from Sherwood and is moving on to Oak. So it was just a few years ago that I was in a similar situation like you, where my child attended the smaller sort of community feel of an elementary school, moving up to big Sherwood. And so it's important to me that I feel like you as parents, as well as your child, feel safe and supported when they come to Sherwood in the fall. What I can tell you is that we had shared out information with your child in the spring. We did some virtual visits with your child where they met with our leadership team and our adjustment counselors. They also spoke with some of our students. We also shared with you some information to students as far as what does a day at Sherwood look like. A lot of that information probably came at a time when students may have been thinking about other things, like the summer that was about to happen. So what I can tell you is that we have some plans to reshare some of that information with you, so that at least in a remote setting, whether that's on a weekend or whether that's when you're home after dinner, you can sit down with your child and you can learn a little bit more about what Sherwood looks like in terms of the building, in terms of the schedule, and those types of things. I'd love to be able to say that we have plans to have a large group of people come into the building and bring you through kind of what would be a normal orientation, but I would say the chances of that are pretty unlikely. But what I can tell you is that we are working on having orientation for students and parents in a variety of different ways to make sure that you can experience it and have those questions answered prior to the start of the school year. So I'll be looking for communication from me. Once we have those cohorts figured out, we'll have a better sense of what your needs are, and we can better answer those questions for you.
Thanks, Mr. Kelly. A few different questions here coming in. Wanted to, a couple of things about extracurriculars or co-curricular activities. We mentioned about band, chorus, and orchestra being on hiatus. There was a question about speech and debate. I don't have that a firm answer on that yet, but we did shift speech and debate last year. I know at the high school level to a remote club. I would think it's likely we'd be able to do that as well for middle school speech and debate. There has been a decision that athletics at the middle school level will not take place this fall. It is possible we're going to have high school athletics with some different restrictions, and I know there's going to be some state guidance on that. But the Central Mass area that we compete in for middle school sports, all of the school districts determined that there would not be interscholastic middle school athletics this fall, which is unfortunate because those are some terrific opportunities for students, but it's just something we didn't feel we could pull off under the circumstances at this time. A couple questions about cohort D that I want to try to respond to. One question was about class size in cohort D. We haven't established any specific benchmark on that. But I would expect it would be pretty similar to what class sizes would be under normal circumstances in school. The class size guidelines for middle school by the school committee is 22 to 24 students in a class. Because of space considerations over the last several years, we've typically been closer to 26, 27, 28 students in a class at our middle school level. And I would imagine it would be in a similar range in terms of for a single class. Again, we may try to develop a team approach for cohort D, and it will largely depend on the number of students who select that option. There was a question of whether or not the students in cohort D would have access to textbooks or other materials. Obviously, you won't be coming in and out of the school, but if there were a specific textbook for Shrewsbury that we were providing, we would still be providing that. A lot of the materials and curriculum materials you provide, of course, will be online, and our cohort D students would certainly have access to all of the online software and online textbooks and the like that our students who are in cohorts B and C and A would have as well. So wanted to clarify that. In terms of there was a question about students becoming, if they're in cohort B or C, if they were to become sick and miss some school, not with COVID, but just a general illness, and they were going to be out for some period of time with a bad cold or something, how would that work? And essentially that would work just like it would during normal school. If a student has to miss some time, our teachers are very adept at making sure students are able to make up the work that they've missed. Frankly, the fact that we're set up for remote learning is going to make it certainly probably easier than ever for students to keep track of what's happening with their assignments and submitting work once they feel better and are up to it. But we can certainly be flexible. We're not going to need to move a student to cohort D simply because they're going to be out of school for a week with a bad cold or whatever it might be. So wanted to clarify that for people. There are a number of questions about protocols relative to what would happen if someone tests positive for COVID, how we communicate that, how do we monitor students' health. One thing that we expressed in our reopening plan, and I do encourage everyone to read the plan that's on our website under the news item that's on our homepage. We are not, Massachusetts is not requiring, and we are not approaching things where there's any kind of temperature check on the way into school. The medical experts are saying there are just too many false positives and false negatives for that to be an efficacious approach. We do ask families to do a self-check at home every day, of course, of students before they're sent to school, and we're really emphasizing that if a student's not feeling well, to keep them home. We need parents and families' cooperation on that. This is something we all have to be in together to try to protect each other. If a student develops symptoms during the day, our school nurses will be addressing that. We have protocols we need to follow that the state has outlined for us in terms of isolating a student if they have symptoms, having them picked up right away from school, and then we'll require them to be tested before they can return. If we do have a student or a staff member who tests positive, we will be communicating with anyone who's considered to be a close contact right away to give them that information. That we'll be doing that without giving away the identity of the person who has tested positive, because we need to maintain that confidentiality. We are working on, actually I think have a meeting scheduled early next week with the Central Mass Health Alliance, which is the public health department that we work with in Shrewsbury, in order to go over, along with Noel Freeman, our director of school nursing, on some more specific communication protocols. There's questions, of course, and we're seeing some things in the news about schools in other parts of the country where there's a much, much higher rate of COVID than there is here in Massachusetts, where there's been a lot of quarantining of classes. It's important to remember that having the 6-foot distancing, which by the way does not mean that there's a 6-foot force field around every student that will never be breached. Students will sit 6 feet apart in class. They'll be 6 feet apart when they eat in the lunchroom. We'll work to keep them 6 feet apart when they're outside on their mask breaks and so forth, of course. But there are going to be times when kids pass each other on the way to sharpening their pencil or moving in and out of the room to use the restroom, where with masks they're going to be closer than 6 feet. We need to remember that the definition of a close contact is spending 10 to 15 minutes within 6 feet of someone. And we're certainly structuring things to avoid that happening. That said, we're looking for some more guidance from our medical experts around who would be considered a close contact, and then communicating. We want to be as transparent as possible around communicating the data that we have. Obviously, we don't want people to panic, but we do want to make sure that people know, if there's a situation of a case that affects their own child in some way. And we'll be coming out with some more specific information about how we'll communicate those things before families have to make a final choice. But again, we'll work in concert with public health officials and our medical experts around how we'll work through that. We've been very successful in the summer program we've had so far. That's been a good opportunity for us to work through some of these approaches. We have not had any positive cases to date over a month of our summer school program. Obviously, we'll have a lot more students in school come the fall, and our nursing staff will be very much engaged. We're also adding additional nursing staff in order to help make sure we can respond to any students who have symptoms as quickly as possible. So that's some information about how we're monitoring some of those pieces. We do not have a testing and tracing program in place. I mean, tracing will be tracing contacts because we'll be keeping track of where kids are sitting, who they're interacting with. We'll know what class they're in, of course. And we'll be doing that and working with public health officials on that if the need arises. As far as testing, that's not something we have the capacity of as a school district to do. Like many, I'm sure, I would like to see more robust testing availability to all of us in a proactive way in our country and our state. And my hope is that's going to continue to evolve in a way that provides more access to that. We will also be sending information out. We need to make sure we're following the state's protocols and guidelines about travel. If a family does travel outside of the states that are approved for travel in and out of the state without quarantine, they will need to either quarantine for 14 days or produce a test from within, I believe it's a 72-hour window that shows that they are negative for COVID. So families should keep that in mind as we approach the start of school on September 15th in terms of their student being available and eligible to come in person. So those are a few things relative to the medical piece. Okay, and looking at the questions, a few more that we still have some time here this evening, would like to address. Okay, a lot of these we've already covered. Someone asked, there's a restriction that Governor Baker put into place relative to indoor group gatherings, limited to 25 people. That does not apply to schools in the sense of eating in the cafeteria, for example, where we will have 6-foot distancing, but there will be groups that are larger than 25 eating lunch at the same time in either the cafeteria or the gym. But that restriction does not apply to schools. In the individual classrooms, of course, on a hybrid alternating model, we will have fewer than 25 students. We'll have an average probably closer to 12 to 15 students, depending on how that the numbers come through. Okay, let's see what else we have here. One important question is, what would happen if a student was making a choice not to wear a mask? And I want to be abundantly clear with everyone that the expectation is that all students, with very few exceptions, which I'll speak to in a moment, are expected to wear their mask. It's not going to be a personal choice. If a student who is capable of wearing a mask is just choosing, saying that they're not going to wear it or they take it off, we're going to deal with that situation immediately. It will be dealt with, referred immediately to the school administration. The student, assuming the student doesn't immediately comply with the directive, that student will need to be sent home, and we'll have to have a serious conversation with that family and indicating that the student is not going to wear their mask. They're going to be forced to be in the all remote program. It is not, as is the case in some other parts of the country, an option. It is going to be a requirement. There will be a very small number of students who, because of the significance of their disability, may not be able to wear a mask. Again, we expect that to be rare. And we'll be working with those students and working with them to teach them and how to tolerate and be able to do that as best we can. But again, we think that's going to be very limited. We've also been told by the physicians that we've been engaged with that it is very, very rare that there would actually be a medical reason that a student could not wear a mask. So we expect that any medical exemptions, it could be possible, but it really would be very rare that a student due to a medical condition would not be able to wear a mask. And of course, we'll deal with those on a case-by-case basis. But in a general sense, it is not something that we're going to be able to have students just deciding that they're not going to wear their mask other than the times they're taking a mask break or eating lunch. That's going to be something we're going to enforce very, very rigorously. And that's important for people to understand. And we'll make sure that students understand that and families understand that very directly before we begin school. Okay, I think we've covered a lot of the themes that we're seeing. Let me look at my notes here. Okay, and I think we've covered what I've written down. Let me try to check the Q&A here again. Well, this is an important question. You know, when will students be assigned to teams, when they would know who their teachers are? Again, we're waiting on this decision that families are making, this initial choice this week. And then based on students who will be in school versus students who will be remote, we will be making assignments to teams. Once those teams are established, later this month, you know, we'll release that information to families. So obviously we want to do that as quickly as we can, but we need to do all the things we would normally do, balancing teams out according to, you know, different characteristics such as gender. You know, it's a mix, it's heterogeneously grouped. We also, you know, need to make sure that we have students, you know, spread across so that we have the physical distancing that we can achieve. Once all those things are put together, we'll be able to put those teams together and let people know what team they're assigned to. Okay. A lot of these questions we've already answered, which is a good thing. One question is whether students will remain in just one classroom during the day or if they'll go to multiple rooms. That is still something that is being developed based on the schedule. I know I sound like a broken record, but depending on how many in-person teams there are will depend on whether or not we will have sufficient allied arts staff and foreign language staff to be connected directly with Protect One team. Obviously, we want to minimize movement to the extent that we can, but families who are choosing to send their child in person should know that there will be, to some degree, certainly obviously to attend lunch, but there could be some time when they're moving rooms. But we're trying to, you know, limit the mixing of students to the greatest extent that we can. Okay. Asking about lunch in the cafeteria. Mr. Collins, can you talk a little bit about what we're expecting to see for lunch in school for students who are there in person and the availability of lunches for families or for students who require lunch service but may be choosing remote?
Absolutely. So for every day that schools are in session, whether it's a half day or a full day, we'll be certainly providing an opportunity for students to get a school lunch. It's primarily going to be a brown bag option, probably cold options. So we're going to minimize potentiality of cross-contamination of students, you know, handling things at a salad bar, for example. Those won't exist anymore, nor will condiment bars. So it's going to be a fairly limited menu to start. And then certainly if we go remote and on those days where students are learning from home and are eligible for free and reduced lunch, they will still be eligible to pick up a lunch from school. And just like when we were in the remote mode, if we have to go to remote mode again, we'll have a single point of distribution up at Shrewsbury High School to provide meals for those students and families in need.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. I appreciate that. There's some other great questions here. We want to try to get to as many as we can. There's a question, will students still use backpacks? And yes, they'll be bringing their backpacks in with them, but they'll be bring their backpacks with them into class and keeping their things in them as opposed to using lockers, as was mentioned earlier. There's a few questions here about cohort D, all remote. Will they still have foreign language? The answer to that is yes. Our intent is to provide the same curriculum standards that we would be providing to our other students who are in cohorts A, B, and C. The specific curriculum materials, again, if we need to utilize some additional third-party online curriculum, that would still be aligned with the same state standards that the Shrewsbury curriculum is with. You know, there's different flavors in different districts about how we achieve those state standards, but everyone would be expected to be learning towards the Massachusetts state standards, and we would be expecting to provide foreign language to students who choose cohort D. Again, that could be from potentially a Shrewsbury educator, but it could also potentially be from a third party. And that's an example of maybe we may have to have some standalone specific classes that a student might have to engage in if we're not able to have enough Shrewsbury educators who would be able to teach that remote piece, as well as cohorts A, B, and C. So that hopefully clarifies that. In terms of co-curricular activities, if you're in cohort D, and we did make this a part of our plan, and we spoke to this last Thursday evening, we presented it, students who choose the all remote cohort D will still be eligible to participate in school co-curricular activities. So if that's an after-school club that might be done remotely, such as speech and debate as one example, if we are able to have athletics perhaps in the spring and we're still in this hybrid model, even if the students in cohort D, we don't want to deny people participation in these different opportunities. If there's student voice, sort of student government types of activities, there's community service clubs. These are all things that we want all of our students to be able to participate in, and we certainly don't want cohort D students disconnected from their school community in those ways. So that's something that is important for families to know when they're making that choice as well. Okay. More questions about cohort D? All right, there's a question about meeting teachers before the start of school. Again, we don't have specific plans about what's going to be possible. Those of you who have looked at the plan and the other information we sent home at the end of last week know that the delay of the start of school for students has been delayed until Tuesday, September 15th, I believe. And there are going to be what would have been the first 10 days for staff starting August 31st will be essentially training and planning days and collaboration days. What kinds of orientation for students and meeting teachers we may be able to accomplish during that time is something we're still working out the details of. But I can assure you that it's really important to us that relationships between teachers and students, whether those are remote, whether those are in person to some degree, those are just critically important. We want our students to be as connected with their educators as they can be. One of the challenges, of course, is that last year when we had to go into the emergency shutdown, students already knew their teachers. This year, these will be new teachers that they're getting to know. And so our teachers are going to be working hard, and I'm very confident because I have absolute total faith in the quality of of what our teachers do for our students. And I know that our teachers will work hard to make sure that in whatever innovative way they can, they're going to help to establish those relationships with our students, because great learning happens when teachers have good relationships with their students and vice versa. So class cultures, class climates, whether they're in person or remote, that's something we're going to be paying a lot of attention to as well. How that's going to, how we'll be able to introduce that, we're still working on that. Some questions about school supply lists, we'll provide that. There's going to be some limitations to sharing supplies, of course. So we'll make sure that people get that well in advance of the first day of school. Let's see here. Other questions before we wrap up? Maybe Mr. Collins, can you talk a little bit about some people, questions about cleaning and what the Public Buildings Department is going to be doing about cleaning schools?
Sure. So obviously, based upon the Department of Ed guidance and just kind of good practices that we know also from the CDC, the Public Buildings Department will be hiring additional staff during the daytime to provide more continuous cleaning of high-touch areas like door handles, bathroom facilities, and then also making sure that we're cleaning desks or tables between lunch services. So that's certainly part of the plan. And then during the changeover, if you will, of the cohorts from B to C, there will be a complete sanitation of the school. And that will go through every space and sanitize those spaces for the next cohort to show up. At the high school, we're certainly going to rely upon students as well to participate in cleaning their own desktops as they change classes. And there might be some of that too at the middle school level. So we'll have cleaning supplies in the schools as well. And we want everybody to participate and be an active member in terms of maintaining hygiene, both for themselves and their workspaces. So different expectations. Of course, we're in a pandemic, and so everybody's going to have to participate, but there are certainly additional staff resources planned to be hired for Public Buildings Department.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. We're going to wrap up by 8 o'clock here, and just want to try to get to as many of these as we can. We have over 200 and almost 230 questions in the Q&A. And we will review all these questions, and we'll incorporate all the different themes into the FAQ we are going to be publishing shortly as well. One question was about how we handle holidays in terms of cohort B and C and having an equitable amount of time in school. Our plan right now is that we'll publish this more specifically as we get closer to the school year, is that if there were a Monday holiday, that we would not have the Wednesday in remote day that week, that we would have 2 days of learning, in-person learning for both groups. So, if there's a Monday holiday, cohort B would attend full days in person on Tuesday and Wednesday, and cohort C would remain attending on Thursday and Friday. So that's how we'll handle evening that out over the course of the school calendar. There's a question about whether or not remote plans will be published at a certain time each week. We want to be sure, obviously, that our students are clear on their expectations for their work that's remote. What, of course, is different for the students who are in the remote or hybrid program is that they're going to be seeing their teachers 2 days a week. They'll be getting some clear guidance from them, of course. We do anticipate on a typical 5-day week that on the Wednesday, and this was another question, the Wednesday mornings, we're expecting that students are going to be engaged with live interactions with their teachers throughout the morning in different ways, and that's going to be an opportunity when the teachers can engage with all of the students on their team, both in cohorts B and A, B, and C, all simultaneously. A lot of expectations will be set then, I'm sure, and then we're working out some details about how we might be publishing the expectations and making sure students understand what the schedule is for the days that they were doing the mix of learning on their days when they're at home. So we'll be trying to make sure there's as much clarity as possible about those things. And then another question is whether or not, what kind of metric might trigger us to shift from an in-person to having everybody go remote like we did last spring. Obviously, if the state goes into a situation where the governor orders another shutdown in terms of people needing to essentially a stay-at-home order, then we're going to be obviously required to be providing remote learning and everyone being at home. But there may be some certainly in-between situation where there might be a situation that is more unique to Shrewsbury or Central Massachusetts or unique to our own school district where we feel like we need to shift gears and not be in person for some period of time. If that seems like it might be a limited period of time, like a matter of a week or two, where we're assessing if the numbers are going in the wrong direction, if they're coming back the right way, we certainly would just stay with the same kind of situation and keep kids in their cohorts, for that limited time, and hopefully resume in-person instruction as quickly as possible. As far as a metric we may use, the new metric the state released yesterday, we need to become a little more familiar with that, but that could be a reasonable tool with that color-coded white, green, yellow, and red that cases per 100,000 over a 14-day period in combination with what the testing positivity rate is. We're looking at some pieces around what that might look like in terms of making a decision to say, we're getting to a metric where we feel like the in-person needs to be put on pause or revert back to an all remote learning. There's also some questions about if a vaccine becomes available, will we go back to normal at some point this year? There's nothing that I would like more than that to happen. And so I think that I'll wrap up. I think we'll be able to answer a lot of questions this evening. We'll follow up in writing in answering as many as we possibly can in our FAQ. And I really deeply appreciate the families who have engaged with us and who are watching, and the staff who are watching as well, and taking the time to learn a little bit more about our plan. Again, I'm sorry that I can't answer every detail for everyone and we couldn't get to everyone's questions, but hopefully this was helpful in helping families make the best choice you can at this point in time. But we do ask you that you make a choice by Friday so that it can help us make these more specific plans. And if you're not sure, that's okay. I think just take the judgment of what you think is going to be in the best interest of your child. And we respect whatever choice that is that you make. But you know, I just want to wrap up by saying that we recognize how incredibly difficult this is for families to not have students in school every day. It creates very, very difficult childcare situations for families where parents' jobs don't lend themselves to be at home. It's also putting a lot of our staff in a very difficult situation as well due to the situation with their own children. And we are looking for a variety of ways to try to address that. But you know, unfortunately, we're just not in a situation where we know we have some families who would prefer to have their children in school 5 days a week. We're not in a situation where we can do that and follow the public health guidelines that we believe we can follow to make a return to school in person a safe one. There is always a measure of risk that's involved with anything. And we are following the guidance and the expertise from public health officials and medical experts based on the statistics as they exist right now in Massachusetts and in Shrewsbury, with the plan going back in this alternating schedule. But I do ask that everyone continue to try to demonstrate flexibility, try to demonstrate adaptability, try to be sure that we're treating each other with empathy and with grace. That is how we'll get through this together as a community. Our staff, who are extraordinary, and with whom I couldn't be more proud in terms of what they do for students in Shrewsbury. And I've always appreciated the very, very high degree of support that we have from our family community. That's what makes this a very special town. It makes it a very special school district. And I'm confident that we will get through this together in providing the very best education we can for your children under the circumstances that we face. And so I appreciate you bearing with us as we work through some very, very complex work. But certainly I do look forward. I've already stated, I already know what the probably the best day of my career is going to be. That's the day that we're back into school in a normal way after we've come through to the other side of this pandemic. Unfortunately, we don't know when that will be. Hopefully it's sooner rather than later. But right now we're going to be focusing on what we can do for our students this fall to help serve them as well as we can. And do that by supporting our educators and supporting our families to the greatest extent we can. Again, with everyone's health and safety and well-being foremost in our mind. So I'd like to thank everyone for participating. I want to thank our panelists. Thank you to Dr. Jones and Mr. Kelly. Thank you to Mr. Collins and Ms. Belcito. Thank you to Ms. Fritz for being on the call. And I know we have school committee members watching live and for their continued support. Thank you to our interpreters. And again, we look forward to serving your students. And thank you for tuning in this evening. Good night.